We are studying the chapter titled The Evolution of the Spiritual Man, where Sri Aurobindo describes the emergence of the spirit out of mind. It is a transition in human evolution of which there is no precedent, there is no equivalent, and so necessarily there are aspects to it which are so new that we have no signposts, we have no references. And that is why this chapter is so valuable. First of all, Sri Aurobindo makes an analogy showing similarity between how mind emerges out of life. That at first mind is so heavily mixed that you cannot distinguish what is mind and what is life. They are literally life impulses which are turning towards some kind of thought, towards some kind of self-awareness, what you see in the most developed animals. But once the mental awareness comes into its own as a separate power, then it rapidly begins to organize itself. Not only that, it turns back upon life, turns back upon the body, and reshapes them into its own terms. This process is still ongoing in most of humanity, and it is a large part of our normal human life that we look at our body and we say, to be healthy, I need to clean my body. I need to eat certain types of food. I need to relate to other people, and so I need to wear proper clothes. I need to appear neat. I need to be respectful. All of these are mental values which are being imposed upon the physical instincts and the life instincts and reshaping them to its terms. A large part of humanity is still not fully mentalized in its life. It is still in a semi-barbaric value system, and mind is still struggling to come into its own to make a fully mental life. Meanwhile, in the parts of humanity where the mind has already reached a kind of an acme, there is the emergence of the spirit which is taking place, and with a similar pattern. At first it is so heavily mixed in the mind's activity that you cannot separate it. You cannot distinguish what is spiritual and what is mental. And so in the portion that we read last time, Sri Aurobindo took great pains to show you the actual emergence of the spirit and the stages of emergence, to distinguish it from the mind. For example, what we saw was that in the mind itself there is a part of the consciousness that can stand back from the mind and can be experienced as a soul in mind, as if an essence of mind, or in the emotions a similar soul of emotion, or even in the body an essential. But these are not the spirit. Behind these three is something other than. And this is the key idea: other than mind, other than life, other than body. When you experience something in you which is not your mind or your emotions or your body, that's when you're beginning to touch the spiritual. But this itself, Sri Aurobindo points out, goes through stages of emergence. As it comes into its own, it can then grow all the way to a higher, even an intuitive perception, and opening still beyond to a universality and then even a transcendence. But meanwhile, its first relationship with mind, life and body is at first a support. It's there while your normal life continues. It's there as a support. It gives you strength, guidance, inspiration at best. But later, it begins to exercise an authority and an influence, shaping your thoughts. You begin to realize this kind of thinking does not suit my deeper parts. This emotional reaction is not compatible with the inner, deeper sensitivity. And so a change begins. With that, it can go quite far until the whole mind, life, body is like an instrument for it to act, but they remain pretty much what they are. That's not enough. It can go even further. It can actually turn upon them and infuse its power. its light, its consciousness, and recast the mind, reshape it until it becomes no more even a developed power of intellect, but it actually becomes an instrument of the spirit, even a spiritual mind, a spiritualized life, and eventually even a spiritualized physical body. That's the direction in which the whole spiritual evolution is taking us. And now Sri Aurobindo comes to, having set the distinction between mind and spirit in a broad sense, he comes into details of this emergent process and the heavy mixtures which are involved in it, and particularly the forms of mind which are easy to misrepresent or misunderstand as being spiritual. So this next paragraph which we will look at, he actually first describes what is not spiritual, although humanity, you will see, in a large part thinks it to be spiritual. And then he will reassert what in these things makes spiritual or not. And this distinction is going to be critical. One of the most shocking elements of this description will be the painful recognition of how much of humanity is stuck thinking it is spiritual, but is stuck in merely moral or other refinements of thought or emotions. And so much of what passes in as religious practice is stuck in that domain. So we will study this now in detail. Sri Aurobindo writes, at first, this truth of the spirit and of spirituality is not self-evident to the mind. Man becomes mentally aware of his soul as something other than his body, superior to his normal mind and life, but he has no clear sense of it, only a feeling of some of its effects on his nature. This is the first step when the spiritual consciousness is emerging in evolution. Now remember, Sri Aurobindo is describing this at the level of the broad evolution of all humanity. So you can consider these to be stages in human evolution, looking at the mass going through these steps. But at the same time, each one of us is going through these steps. You will see this in yourself when you look back at your past. And even those of us who have been in a kind of a sustained spiritual journey across a few lives, in a sense, we go through all these stages in our awakening in each life. Because as we grow, we are first most identified with our body, and then the emotional development comes out, and then the mental development. Meanwhile, if there is a spiritual influence, it is felt like this. And so all of us can identify with each of these stages, not only in the stages of emergence, but even right now. As we are today, even if we consider to have an active spiritual life, you will recognize these stages are present in us. And to recognize them is extremely valuable. And then as he describes each of the next stages, we can lift these into their successive steps of emergence consciously. So the first step is when the spirit, the truth of the spirit and of spirituality is not self-evident to the mind. It's not obvious where is this spirituality. I feel occasional touches of it. I sense something. There is a kind of a state. Man becomes mentally aware of his soul as something other than his body. A businessman, and there are many examples of this today, recognizing that he does not have within his power of intellect the capacity to come to a right decision under circumstances which are conflicting, will often take a call and say, let me take a few days and I will get back with a decision. Now at that point, what he does, he is himself not conscious of. There is the example of somebody, I believe it was the head of the Godrej group of companies, who had next to his boardroom a meditation room. He would step out of the boardroom, go to his meditation room and do whatever thing he does which is his meditation, and then come back and declare his decision. But what did he do in the meditation? What made him come to the clarity of the decision? He's himself not sure. All he knows is, I go into this other kind of state, and in that state somehow I know what is the right thing to do, or at least I know which is the better thing to do. At least he had a word meditation, he had a room for it. But most others may not have that recognition, but they realize they enter a kind of an altered state of awareness, in which the decision is either made or is shown. Everybody successful in their own field in life has some experience of this kind. What that is, we don't quite know. The mind knows there is some other state, and that's all. Something other than his body, superior to his normal mind and life, to which he has to tap when he does not have a solution in the normal mind and life. But no clear sense, just a vague feeling of some effect. When I'm in that state, suddenly things are calm, clear, I feel good, I even feel light and uplifted. That all of these are registrations in your normal human nature of the influence of that. It is not a description of the spiritual state. Next, as these effects take a mental form or a life form, the difference is not firmly and trenchantly drawn. The soul perception does not acquire a distinct and assured independence. So now this is becoming more familiar. Perhaps every day I sit for my morning exercise, my morning meditation, contemplation. For somebody who's extremely materialistic in approach, his state of contemplation with spirit may be when he goes jogging in the morning in the park. And at that time he feels a kind of a transcendence from his littleness. While jogging, the body becomes somewhat tired and his mind is as if freed into a lightness, and he has a floating sensation and a great calm and release. I've even found some people having something of this when they're driving in the city. Somehow the fact that you're in the car and you're isolated from the sounds and noises, your body is mechanically engaged, your mind is stuck in the automatism, frees some deeper part of you and you feel this release. But whatever the form it takes, there are these frequent moments but not clearly distinguished. And now comes the problem of that, because it is so heavily mixed. Very commonly indeed, a complex of half effects of the psychic pressure on the mental and vital parts, a formation mixed with mental aspiration and vital desires, is mistaken for the soul, just as the separative ego is taken for the self, although the self in its true being is universal as well as individual in its essence. Or just a mixture of mental aspiration and vital enthusiasm and ardor, uplifted by some kind of strong or high belief or self-dedication or altruistic eagerness, is mistaken for spirituality. So 3 broad categories of mixture he is describing. Within each there are finer facets of the category. The first is a complex of half effects of psychic pressure. From within, the individual soul's influence is pushing forward, and there is a half effect, and there's a mix of these half effects on the mental and vital parts. So in my mind, there is some kind of a lightness, floating feeling, feeling calm, feeling quietly happy. Suddenly all the problems of the world fade away. In the emotions, suddenly I feel a great joy or some kind of a great enthusiasm for doing things better. And as a result, there's a formation mixed with mental aspiration and vital desires, is mistaken for the soul. I once had this very interesting conversation. It's not something nice to share openly, but I think it's time these things should be spoken of openly, at least among those who seek a deeper spirituality. It was at one of the centers associated with Sri Aurobindo, and I had a conversation. It was in a country outside India, so many people who come for those lectures. And I said to them, I'm not very keen on returning because it's quite one thing to share stories of the mother and Sri Aurobindo, to feel good, to experience a high, and then we go away feeling good and nothing changes. You come back the next year, it's exactly the same thing, the same people in the same way. Has there been an effort to change consciousness? Probably not, for the most of them at least. And sometimes the numbers can be large, especially if there's an Indian community, they enjoy the satsang. And then somebody there said, but it keeps us going. Each of these sessions, it keeps us going for 3 or 4 months. The high that you get. But what is that high if you think about it? It kept you going for 3 or 4 months and then it went away. But what was the high? Momentarily the emotions were uplifted. Oh, you heard these beautiful stories. Generally what attracts the mind or the heart is something miraculous, something moving to the emotions, the sentiments, something which brings tears of joy, tears of some emotional upheaval, or in the mind a great clarity of a beautiful understanding or picture, or saying, oh, this is the wonderful work that Sri Aurobindo and the mother did, this is the wonderful work that is happening. You look at the forms, you feel good. And what was the good was that in this satsang, something of the inner soul's aspiration, something of its bhakti or its idealism reflected in the mind and in the emotions, lifted them up for a while. And the touch of that stays and lasts for a few months and then it fades out. But this is enough to mistake for my soul came forward. My psychic being is happy and emerges, or I have now a spiritual center that I experience. And then it fades away. And if it fades away, you know that it was not it. Then obviously it was a reflection of it. And what did you do after that? When it came forward, you enjoyed the immersion of that. Again, another example is, I was with some distant relatives, let's say, and it was their morning prayer time. I was with them. They stood with hands folded in India and they recited a prayer, very common prayer recited almost everywhere, Jai Jagadisha Hare. And initially as they were reciting it, one could feel a concentration, an invocation, an aspiration, lifting the whole mood, the environment. And then as they went on, after 3 or 4 lines of the verse, one of them started clapping. And then the others joined in. And then the body started moving with the clapping. And immediately the spiritual mood was broken. And there was instead a vital excitement. And it was so disappointing. So after the whole thing was over, I asked them, why do you clap? I said, oh, because that's how people do it. That's how we grew up. Others around us were doing it. And so we followed that. And then I pointed out that it broke the whole atmosphere. And they said, oh yeah, we didn't think about it. We didn't notice it. But in that moment, initially, there was a lift of something. And then when the vital excitement begins, the clapping, the chanting, the shouting, screaming, whatever form it may take eventually, and it's often described as religious fervor, you have completely replaced or covered up the deeper aspiration which was barely beginning in a very fragile form to come forward. I was at Vrindavan once, some years ago, in one of the most famous temples, Banke Bihari temple. And we were given a privilege of going there early in the morning when the doors are closed and you sit before, because Krishna is supposed to have played through the night and now he comes to rest. He's sleeping. So we had that privilege. We went again when it was open to public. And when I came the first time, the temple was empty and there were these strong metal barriers. To get from the back of the temple to the front, you had to literally go round and round, and it was steel barriers so thick, 4 inches in diameter. And I was wondering, why do you need something so ugly, so crude, so strong? And I understood why. Because what took place later was ugly. We went for the formal darshan. The place was full, but because we were part of the special group, we were allowed to stand in front. And then as they were chanting, the temple doors open, the sanctum sanctorum is exposed. Behind, there was a huge surge of people, a few hundred people, pushing hard on each other, pushing against the barrier. Literally, you could see the steel bending and shouting and screaming in whatever fervor. And, well, I was curious to see the form of the idol, so I kind of came up. I stood up, I was tall, and the lady behind me rammed me down forcefully, clung at me, dragged me down literally. It was so violent, so ugly, so crude. And the steel barriers were, well, I suppose, meant to contain that. And here inside was a very beautiful presence, and outside was this crude, ugly, inhuman behavior. And that contradiction somehow never left me. It left such a bad taste. Unfortunately, this is celebrated as religious fervor. And one questions what help it has for people. And this question has bothered me for a long time. One of the things which I recognized, and Sri Aurobindo explains this later in the chapter, later in the paragraph, that it is at best an initial preparatory phase which helps to purify emotions or raise them. Of course, there's nothing in that behavior which I described which had any purifying influence, but this mental vital parts, a mixed formation of mental aspiration, vital desires, is mistaken for the soul. And you will hear people say things like, my soul is so fulfilled, so happy when I go to this place or do this ritual or meet such and such, whatever form it is. He gives the other example of the error. Just as the separative ego is taken for the self, although the self in its true being is universal as well as individual in its essence. So in the English language we will say, if you observe yourself, automatically what you mean by yourself is this awareness that is observing, and often a mental awareness or just the sense of the ego. I came to this recognition sometimes the hard way with certain groups where there was not formally, or in certain cultures where there was not a strong spiritual background of culture, especially in the West, in the parts of Europe which are extremely materialistic, denying anything to do with spirit or religion. In those parts, there are always individuals which have a spiritual aspiration, but when you speak to them about the soul or self, it took me a while to recognize that they understood by it their ego sense. And then, once I recognized that, I began to explain the distinction between the ego and the soul or the self. But the first identification is, what is your true self? It is this. And because the entire upbringing today of what we call modern education is so materially rooted, everything in the education puts this ego as the true self, organizes the whole personality around fulfillment of the ego, and makes the personal drive of the ego the single most important factor in your education. And so one of the forms it takes is that, for example, if I take one place in Europe, in France particularly, but many other countries, the whole object of the education is to teach you to affirm yourself and assert yourself, your ego self. And so when a spiritual practice requires you to give yourself or open yourself to something higher, it is such an alien experience that it feels wrong. Or if there is the spontaneous emergence of a spiritual experience, of a deeper sense of I or self, or just the spiritual inner presence of the soul or self, the person says, there's something wrong within me. I feel as if my body is not mine. I need to go to a psychiatrist. And the sense of dissociation from the body is felt to be abnormal, and rather than recognizing the spiritual value of it, you try to shut it out. In its extreme, this was an experience I have shared perhaps before. I was in Hong Kong, in the university, talking to the head of a computer department. You don't expect anything spiritual there. And the man is talking about his projects, and in his project there's a vocabulary he uses. It's not just for social good. There's a dimension to it which is touching an ideal, which is almost spiritual. And so I'm looking at him as he's speaking with such enthusiasm, and I feel this vibration, and I say, where's this coming from? What is your practice? He says, no, nothing. And I said, well, do you have some philosophy? Because sometimes in the Chinese tradition, they have some deep philosophical practices. No, he says. Any religion? No. Finally, I had to ask him, where is this coming from? There's something in your language which is something so special. And he says, he is embarrassed. And then he says, when I was in my late teenage, one day I just woke up. And I had this incredible experience, as if the whole universe was alive and full of love. And every single object and person was pouring love towards me. And from my heart, I was pouring love to every single thing and every single person and the whole universe. And I'm looking at him with open eyes, and I said, and then? And he says, I couldn't function. Well, I said, how long did it last? Well, it went on for a few weeks, and I couldn't function. And so I said, and then? My friends took me to a psychiatrist, and he put me on medication, and the experience went away. That's it. He never had it again after that. And here, when I met him, he was in his 30s perhaps, maybe early 40s. And I said to him, if you were in India, they would have worshipped you as a saint. But the moment you have identified your ego as your true self, any experience of something deeper which is non-egocentric is felt as an aberration. And you experience something which destabilizes the false sense of I. And rather than recognizing the true value of it, you now try to undo it. You try to break out of what is now emerging. This is so unfortunate. It is the easiest way by which the forces that want to prevent the emergence of the spiritual can spoil the work, precisely by giving this false focus of the ego as the self. Or, third category, just a mixture of mental aspiration and vital enthusiasm and ardor, uplifted by some kind of strong or high belief or self-dedication or altruistic eagerness. So, subcategories within this. But what is the common feature here? Mental aspiration and vital enthusiasm. I want to do good in the world. I want to create a space where everyone can be happy. I want to create a school where children can grow to find their soul, live by their deeper values, whatever words you like. Although you don't know what that word means, but it means for you some ideal. And so there's this mixture, and within that mixture is this uplift of a strong or high belief. The belief can be inculcated from childhood. From my childhood, my grandmother taught me that if you do good, then God will reward you at every step. Suppose. Or if you spread happiness, happiness will come to you. Or the universe is there to help you. Some belief like that. And you've got that belief. It's a strong belief or a high belief. Or self-dedication. I feel my whole life is given to this purpose, to uplift the poor and the downtrodden, to bring justice to those to whom it is denied, or altruistic eagerness to give, to do good for others. And this good example is our social activists, sometimes with a religious turn. So I don't want to take names because some of these very highly respected figures. There is one who went into politics, and maybe perhaps it's time to take names. Mahatma Gandhi, as somebody in politics who spoke of purity in politics, truth in politics, and certain high ideals and keywords, was presented. Even the term Mahatma, great soul or great self, was placed before him. But there was nothing in his teaching which was spiritual. The entire teaching was of moral and ethical purity, largely influenced of the Tolstoyan variety of Christianity, where there is this peculiar turn that the more you suffer, the more you become pure, and the more you'll be rewarded by God, if not in the life beyond life after death. So the whole teaching that came with him was suffer with joy. Sri Aurobindo makes this slightly disrespectful comment almost. Getting beaten with joy. That was his teaching. So literally, you had to go, offer your head, get whacked, come back, put a bandage. When you get cured, you go again, get your head whacked. And the more you suffer, the more you are purified, and somehow the purity of your intention will melt the heart of the enemy, and your problem will be solved, and the right thing will be done. And that was what he called soul force. Now you see, the vocabulary is very important. The spiritual vocabulary is now co-opted into a moralistic and even a perverted form of moralism. And so when Hitler was on the brink of invading England, he wrote a letter to the Prime Minister of England. Mahatma Gandhi wrote a letter to the Prime Minister of England saying, "You will not fight with violence. You will allow the enemy to enter, even if he kills your men and rapes your women, and you will not use violence, you will fight him with soul force." What? And if you see the cinema of the 1960s and 70s in India, they were heavily influenced with this moralistic, which was given a spiritual turn, moralistic, holier-than-thou position, where, let's say, the good guy and the bad guy are at the final stage of the fight. That's the final stage of the movie. The good guy, let's say, has a gun. The bad guy has nothing. Rather than arresting him and getting done with it, the good guy throws away the gun. Now I will fight you from my weaker position, and on the strength of my moral, righteous, superior, spiritual position. That was the idea. You weaken yourself, you become poor, and this was the part of Gandhiji's example. When Birla gave him a check for a very large sum, he tore up the check in a very dramatic form and threw it saying, "I don't need your money." What is the statement there? I am so great in my poverty that I don't need your money. And somehow the money is impure, inferior, corrupting influence. And those around him made this comment, people don't realize how much it costs to keep him poor. The whole machinery of maintaining that poverty appearance and all that was very expensive. There were others who did great things, and this is not to deny the good work that he did in the field of education, in fighting for whatever changes in society and so on. Acharya Vinoba Bhave similarly is raised to the level of a saint because he began this movement of giving up land. Those who had more land gave it up to those who didn't have land. It was an excellent corrective measure when, under Islamic rule followed by British colonial rule, land properties had become centralized in the hands of a few, and the bulk of the people were reduced to working indentured labor, slave literally. And so the reversal of that process was a necessary part, but it was a social change. It was an economic change. It did not have any spiritual value in itself. Or at best preparatory as a purification of your emotions and your narrow egocentric selfishness, becomes less egocentric. But again, at best a preparation for a spiritual, but not spiritual in itself. But people would deal with him as if a great spiritual worker or spiritual figure. And this question is extremely important because for many, coming to a place like the Sri Aurobindo ashram and seeing zero social work taking place, no free hospitals, no free facilities which they associate with spirituality or ashrams, they'll say, where is the spirituality here? People are busy doing their own thing, living a comfortable life, working like anywhere else. Some of them have mobile phones and televisions. Where's the poverty which would make it spiritual? And so, if they go with that idea, of course, they're disappointed. On the other hand, anybody who builds a huge movement, open an orphanage, open a hospital, run free service for poor people, and you're raised as at the level of a spiritual, saintly person. And of course, if you look at the way the system works, and I've seen this in many cases, you open an orphanage, that's the easiest way to raise money, and the orphans you've got become your free workers for your institution. And so there is a very deep selfish motive in the whole thing. And the altruism that is presented as the face is not quite what it is. And Sri Aurobindo makes this observation elsewhere in the Synthesis of Yoga. He says, this altruism is one of the most extreme forms of egoism, because it is about how great I am in the very fact that I am so generous. Or it masks in this way, puts up this appearance, I am looking after so many downtrodden, but secretly, that's my free service workers' base for my institution to be built up. And of course, they are your first disciples because they are so grateful to you and you make sure they are reminded of it. And so that's how they build a movement. I'm giving these examples because you will find so many today and it's so common. But none of this has any element of spirituality in itself. Of course, somebody with spirituality may be driven to social work. That's a different story. So, a mixture of mental aspiration, vital enthusiasm and ardor uplifted by some kind of strong or high belief or self-dedication or altruistic eagerness is mistaken for spirituality. A very large part of what goes under the name of spirituality today is only this. But this vagueness and these confusions are inevitable as a temporary stage of the evolution, which, because ignorance is its starting point and the whole stamp of our first nature, must necessarily begin with an imperfect intuitive perception and an instinctive urge or seeking without any acquired experience or clear knowledge. So straight away the justification for this mixture is given. Vagueness, confusion, because we start with an ignorance. You're aiming towards a higher knowledge, but your starting point is an ignorance. And so the whole stamp of your initial movement will be this mixture. Imperfect intuitive perception and an instinctive urge or seeking without experience or clear knowledge. This is the problem. So within you there's an intuition. You feel that somehow in working for others, I'm opening myself to the divine in everybody. I'm serving the divine in everyone. That's the deeper truth of the intuition. But it is mixed and very quickly reduces itself to social service. By doing good, by bringing a smile on the face of somebody, I will serve God. And well, but you're not really doing anything of spiritual value. In our ashram, somebody at a very senior position of the administration who had never bothered to read Sri Aurobindo much, didn't have much of a developed mind even, who grew up as a child in the ashram but had somehow by some accident of circumstances got to a position of power, very influential, would make these facile statements. And it was at a time when large numbers of people began. It was 1993, 94, 95. Large numbers of tourists began to be herded to the ashram. Somebody had put the ashram on the tourist map in Chennai. and thinking he was doing good. The result was busloads of people would come because that was the route they had to go from this temple to the next, and somewhere along the way, Sri Aurobindo ashram. So they would stop, people would come down, they needed to use the toilet, and they would go to the ashram for that. And they would be herded around the samadhi. Someone would ask, who is this, what is this, who is Aurobindo, who is mother, which mother, Mother Teresa? Huge confusion and mixture. So many in the ashram experienced the huge dilution that came with that. And here was this person in authority who made this facile statement. Even if one person is touched out of the thousands, it is worthwhile. Now you can see behind that there is an intuition. And that's what gives to this perversion a justification. That yes, if one person awakes, any effort you make is worthwhile. But look at the form it takes. 1,000 people will destroy something good in the hope that one person may be awakened? No, it's not true. If somebody was ready to be awakened, they would find their way somehow. You do not need to herd 1,000 people and destroy something so precious in the process. But this is how an imperfect intuition gives to this mix of mind or emotion, sentimental values, a touch of something true, and you catch that part truth, not recognizing the huge falsehood that comes with it. So imperfect intuitive perception. This is the first cause of this error. The second is instinctive urge or seeking without acquired experience or clear knowledge. Something within me wants to do. What can I do? Do something. So this is another style you will see, and again our ashram has been a victim of this. It was, I believe it was 1990s again, when many of these mixed elements came in, and it was at that time the 100th anniversary or 50th anniversary of some event. Maybe it was 50th anniversary of, doesn't matter. So here's an anniversary, 50th anniversary or 100th anniversary. What do? Do something. What can you do? Everything is pretty much as it should be. Well, let's dig up the footpath and replace it with more fancy tiles. As an example, I want to do good. I want to do something. What can I do? There's nothing to be done. So, you will see if you go to the temple in Jagannath temple in Puri, old stones. They're actually very beautiful. Some of them are 800 or 1,000 years old. You walk on them, you can feel something of that, something which it carries. And then every now and then a garish marble plaque fixed in the foot with the name of somebody, donated by so-and-so. And of course you're walking on it. And I asked them, why do they do this? What do they do with the old stones? If they're throwing away. He said, they throw it away. I said, I would like to take one back, They throw it away to put with a modern, new, fresh marble piece offered by a devotee. And the idea behind, my name will have so many thousands of devotees or millions of devotees walking over it. I will be blessed by their feet. Again, you see, it's so ridiculous when you think of it rationally. But if you allow a sentimentality to enter into it, I am made so humble by the feet of 1 million people stepping, and they are devotees, and somehow I am less than them, I am blessed by them. Again, you see a glimpse of something which might be true, but it's so heavily mixed that it becomes ridiculously false. And there is no real acquired experience or clear knowledge, but an urge to do, I want to help. And so many temples, old temples, they have replaced the walls or covered it with modern tiles. In the ashram guest house where Sri Aurobindo first stayed, he would walk in the open veranda on the first floor, and the bricks which were the flooring got worn out from his walking. A groove had formed from his walking. He was walking so much, and in deep meditation. Now, anybody with some sensitivity would say, this is so precious. Let's protect it. Somebody in his enthusiasm, oh, now we have the money, let's make it beautiful. It's a beautiful place. Sri Aurobindo lived here, let's make it beautiful. He relaid the entire flooring with tiles. With fancy, expensive, I don't know what it was, granite or tiles. And covered up that thing which was so precious otherwise. And we don't realize why the urge. An urge comes to do something and so it moves. But what is missing? What makes for this distortion possible? No acquired experience or clear knowledge. Now either of these would save us from a lot of mixture. And it's worth dwelling upon these terms Sri Aurobindo uses almost in passing. The corrective measure, considering that we all have to pass through that passage of ignorance, always our initial ideas of spirituality or even our practices will be mixed. Always our experiences will be partial, mixed or even distorted. Let's assume that. What do we need for correction? Acquired experience. Some touch of the experience where you begin to feel what that is. Against which now the mixture becomes obvious. Now I don't know what's mixed in it. I don't know what's the truth of it, but I know it is mixed. Or clear knowledge. It's the reason why Sri Aurobindo took so much trouble to write. It's the reason why the mother would sit down with the children in the playground and the disciples also and take classes with them. So in the beginning of her classes, she made this observation that over the next few years, I will be taking you through a process of graded training for what you need to do to awaken to a spiritual life. 5 years down, somebody asks, Mother, 5 years have passed. Every Wednesday she's having classes. Somebody asks Mother, Mother, you told us in the beginning that you'll give us this training. When are you going to start? And of course she says, that's what I've been doing all this while. But of course the way she did it didn't match their expectation of what training would be. They thought training would be, now you will sit down, concentrate like this, breathe like this, swing your arms up and down or move them this way, and that's how you will get your spiritual experience or whatever. And instead she was speaking of how you can become conscious, you can observe, train your mind, organize your thoughts and become conscious of the deeper presence. Meanwhile, she's imprinting the experience into you. And if you're not conscious of what's happening, well... So, clear knowledge, not mixed knowledge. Again, the mixed knowledge is one of the most dangerous things. And unfortunately, it has taken so many people off track. And we come across so many who, with genuine spiritual aspiration, get sucked into the mixture. One such, and again I will take names, is the mixture which takes place from many of the mixed spiritual vital teachings. One such very famous in recent times was someone who went by the name Acharya Rajneesh. Later he called himself Osho. And while his teaching had a very strong philosophical content, which was rationally presented, he was extremely engaging in his stories, extremely entertaining, which of course built a very good following. What he taught had serious flaws and mixtures. The practices that he gave, one of them being, for example, 1 hour you laugh, then 1 hour you cry, and then at least to his Western disciples it would be 1 hour of free sex. What it did, if you notice, all three things involve a release of intense passions and excitements, destabilizing the vital being, destabilizing your physical nervous system, clouding your mind, and certainly if there was anything of the spiritual, either the true soul or the spirit, it would get very clearly covered up and lost in the process. But the excitement it would generate, laughing, crying, would give a high. And the high is what people would say, I feel so good, I am uplifted, I feel light, I feel free. And he would give to it a justification saying, you're purifying your emotions. And in the name of purifying, so much confusion was added that even took people completely off track. Those who had a strong spiritual sensitivity would avoid, obviously. They would feel something wrong and move out. But those who didn't have the sensitivity, or who were confused in their understanding, and especially in the West, it was very easy to do that because there was not that culturing which would say something is wrong here. Well, they got sucked into it. And so many good people with a genuine spiritual aspiration went off track because of this. In contrast, if you take somebody like Paramahansa Yogananda, who from the very beginning defined his movement as self-realization fellowship. The goal is self-realization. Of course, it was an ascetic tradition involving a withdrawal from life, but the goal declared is self-realization, which obviously is not any of the excitement of the mind or the vital. Himself, having a deep spiritual foundation, was able to imprint that or awaken the touch of that in people. And just that was enough that so many good people could take to a spiritual turn. And of course, people who were, there was a strong reaction, opposition by the church and so on, but still. I'm giving these examples, taking names, because one has to begin to distinguish more and more. There are other movements today, very popular, having followings in the millions, either associated with a miracle. The founder performs miracles, and so this is spiritual. Miracle has nothing to do with spirituality. Anybody engaging with a vital being in a pact can produce a miracle. It does not mean there is any spiritual growth. On the contrary, most people who would have a deep spiritual base would avoid miracles for the simple reason that somebody with no spirituality can perform a miracle and imitate you. Let's say somebody with a spiritual power could, let's say, read your mind or materialize an object. Suppose even that were true. And it would not be a spiritual power to begin with. Somebody else, by a vital being and a tantric process, could acquire the same capacity. How would you distinguish between the two? You cannot. And therefore, those who are spiritually rooted will not get into any phenomena which could be replicated or imitated by something inferior. The mother made it a point to state this in so many words that she will never contact people through automatic writing or through channelings or through pendulums or any of these methods. Why? Because all of them can be imitated, all of them can be produced by any being of the lower gradations of vital worlds. And she said the only pure part of you which they cannot imitate, nobody can infiltrate or mix in, is your psychic center. And so she said, I will only communicate through your psychic center. Which means for you, if you wish to have that contact with the mother and receive her guidance directly, well, you have to make the effort to go behind your emotions, behind your thoughts, become conscious of that deeper, true presence of the soul. And it is only in the purity and stillness of that presence that you will receive the true guidance. And I use these two words. I did not use the word joy or bhakti or devotion of the soul, because those are mixed with emotions and you could imitate, the emotions could imitate them. But the purity and stillness are two things the emotions cannot easily imitate. And it is precisely in that you receive very quietly the gentle, spontaneous, deep awareness, and you know. And it is in the intimacy of that closeness with the mother, felt in that part, the purest part of you, that you can have this pure receptivity and communication. While on the subject, even to warn, people go to the samadhi and a flash of an image comes, or they hear a word or a sound and they say, it happened at the samadhi, so it must be a message from the mother. And mother warned about this. She said, that's precisely where the mischievous beings would try to send you a message, because you are most open and most vulnerable. But the form in which it came is essentially unreliable, because anybody could do it. Any being, even a human being sitting next to you having a strong thought formation, you could catch it. And so it means nothing. It is only true if it comes from deep within, or occasionally when it may come in such a form when you have the confirmation of the deeper psychic sensitivity that says, yes, this was a true experience. And you will feel it deep within, and there will be no doubt. So, what is missing, which allows this mixture, is the lack of acquired experience or clear knowledge. Now, just these statements which we have gone through, which the mother has made explicitly, Sri Aurobindo has described, is a part of the clear knowledge, which is an automatic warning for you, that you will not get stuck in these things easily, recognizing what it is and how it works. Now, Sri Aurobindo continues how the mixture now further develops. Even the formations which are the first effects of the perception or urge, or the first indices of a spiritual evolution, must inevitably be of this incomplete and tentative nature. So, we shall not reject the mixtures just because they are like this. They are our first step. But what are the forms in which it takes place? The first effects of the perception, you perceive something. There's a kind of a presence. At the top of the mountain, I look down and I feel somehow I forget myself. But it mixes in with other things. Urge, something within you rises. I wish there was something more beautiful, more true. Or first indices of spiritual evolution. With that is often the first indice is one of a deep calm or peace, or a kind of a quiet detachment which is unaffected. Or sometimes even for some people it may take the form of an illumination or an awakening to something which is clearer, deeper, truer. All will have this incomplete and tentative nature. But the error so created comes very much in the way of a true understanding, and it must therefore be emphasized that spirituality is not, and he gives a list of things. So this initial error, we accept that it happens, but it prevents the true understanding, and that's why this text is so important. What is spirituality not? So he says, it must therefore be emphasized that spirituality is not, first, a high intellectuality. Then, I'll read the whole thing and then we'll come back. Not idealism, not an ethical turn of mind, or moral purity and austerity, not religiosity or an ardent and exalted emotional fervor, not even a compound of all these excellent things. Sri Aurobindo is saying these are all excellent things, but they are not spirituality. A mental belief, creed or faith, an emotional aspiration, a regulation of conduct according to religious or ethical formula are not spiritual achievement and experience. These things are of considerable value to mind and life. They are of value to the spiritual evolution itself as preparatory movements, disciplining, purifying, or giving a suitable form to the nature, but they still belong to the mental evolution. Okay, so we have read the whole thing, now we go back and look at each of those things. We will recognize in what way they are helpful as a discipline, as a purifying or giving form to our nature. But they are part of the mental evolution which is still incomplete. So first, spirituality is not high intellectuality. People sit down and give lectures. They give talks about spiritual things. They will read certain texts and explain what the meaning of those texts is. I remember it was a meeting we had in Delhi where people from many traditions were invited to the house of a big industrialist on the theme of Bhagavad Gita. It was the Gita Day which he celebrated every year in his house. I was one of those thrown in and somebody else was thrown in. Just, oh yeah, you're from here, so go. And there was a very respected person, head of a religious order, Swami, with large following. And he taught, he spoke whatever he said. And somebody asked him as a question, There's so many people who have commented on the Bhagavad Gita. How do we know whom to follow? How do you know what is right and what is mixed or wrong? And this very respected Swami, he is no more now, who has done great work. He announced that, he said very candidly, he said, first, best book is my book. And he laughed. And he said, every teacher will say that. So no problem there. But how do we know what the meaning of these deeper verses is? Well, I have learned from my guru, who has learned from his guru, who has learned from his guru, who's gone all the way back for thousands of years. That's your source of knowledge. And if you think about it, if you believe this to be true, you can see how every generation would become somehow less. Because you can only contain so much, receive so much, transmit so much, and distort so much. Every generation would become less, if that was all there is. Unfortunately, so many lineages are just that, intellectual teaching. And naturally, the decline of the spiritual content is inevitable. Every now and then, though, in each of these movements, there is somebody who comes, who lifts it back to a spiritual level. And that's how they are regenerated, otherwise they all die out. So many schools of teaching, as they call spiritual or philosophical, have died out because there was no living force left. But if they have been regenerated, then of course they lift up a little bit. So when my turn came to speak, I said, Shri Krishna is the divine presence within you. You are Arjuna. And when you read the Bhagavad Gita, you read it in that way. And the deepest meaning of it will be revealed to you from within. That's the most true and the most complete source that you can get. All human sources will have their limitations and defects. And unfortunately, the senior monk was very unhappy with that. And afterwards, he would avoid me. When we met many times on occasions, he would avoid me and avoid interaction. He was upset about it. But then it made me realize, I asked more about his movement. They have no meditation. They have no spiritual practice of that kind which involves concentrating on a spiritual presence. Their teaching was, you study the scriptures and that is how you will awaken to the spiritual truth of it. And you will get enlightened by thinking about it or understanding it better. So the whole assumption was as if some kind of an intellectual movement awakening your thought, and somebody now realizes, oh yes, now logically I understand that we are all one. Now I have awakened to the truth of it. And you stop there. And I've seen people in that lineage who give lectures, who preach, and who will say, actually, I've come to the realization of oneness. The whole universe is one. And let me prove it to you. And he gives a logical explanation. And he has realized it. And there was not in the tradition the recognition that there is a deeper spiritual experience of oneness, which is different from a mental understanding, even conviction, or even faith in the mind. They're great things, but at best they're a starting point. But they're not the spiritual awakening. So culturing for this high intellectual understanding is extremely valuable. In a sense, that's what we are doing now, in understanding things. But if you dwell on the Bhagavad Gita or the Isha Upanishad or Sri Aurobindo's writings in that way, very useful. But at best it's a preparation discipline, preparing the mind, culturing and orienting it to think in a certain way that makes easier the entry into the spiritual experience. So much of teaching of Sri Aurobindo in schools, in classes, even in our ashram, is flawed because of this. And I will share an interesting incident which took place. One of the students of the ashram school had one of the best teachers in the ashram, great intellectual, teaching him the life divine in the class, formal class. And what do you do when you read Sri Aurobindo? What can you do? Well, you summarize every paragraph. What can you do if you start elaborating on every word and every statement? It will be too long. And they had 3 years of their study. So you summarize and you look at it logically. Oh yeah. And if you do a summary, the logical train involved is so obvious. And sometimes so compellingly obvious. They say, oh yeah, I could have thought of this on my own. So this young man sitting in the class, he began to feel uneasy. And then he wrote to the mother. Fortunately, the mother was there in the body. I believe he wrote, or he spoke, maybe, but I think he wrote. He wrote to the mother saying, "Mother, earlier I used to respect Sri Aurobindo so much. But ever since I've joined this class and I'm studying, I realize that all the arguments that he gives, I could have thought of them. They're no big deal. They're obvious in a way once you understand the logic of it. And I'm losing respect for Sri Aurobindo." And mother immediately sent word to the teacher saying that this student will no more study in your class, he will study on his own. And thereafter he was given to study on his own, he would read on his own, and obviously it had much deeper, subtler dimensions which opened to him, and the respect, I'm sure, returned eventually through that experience. But the moment you have reduced what is not a mere intellectual argument, the life divine is not intellectual argument. What we are reading here is not just intellectual argument. There's a component which is so much more precious, the spiritual value of it. Well, right now there is an intellectual content equally, but behind that, if you touch that and receive that, you'll find it brings such great clarity. It opens you, it prepares you, and even lifts you into an experience. But bringing first clarity into the mind and then opening to the intuition. But if you reduce it to a series of arguments, in summary, you've lost it all. So, high intellectuality, very useful, good discipline for training the mind, purifying it from wrong ideas and giving it a turn towards unity, thinking in terms of underlying onenesses, etc. Very useful, but it's not spirituality. Second, spirituality is not idealism. So somebody lives for an ideal, whether it is an ideal of social service or ideal of bringing purity or truth or rightness or goodness or happiness or whatever form it may take. There's so many great people who have led social change through their idealism, and again they're at best a purifying preparatory step, but in themselves have no spiritual value for the experience itself. Not an ethical turn of mind or moral purity and austerity. He's put all three pretty much close to each other because they're all connected. And the best example we have is in the life of Mahatma Gandhi. Austerity was his first word. To this day, you go to his ashram or institutions connected with him, the austerity is an underlying backdrop. That is associated with purity, and the moral purity particularly is given great importance, and with it a certain ethical turn of mind. Gandhiji himself made many experiments with this, couple of books that he wrote along this, documenting his experiments with truth, where he was struggling and fighting with his moral mixtures and confusions and pulls and pushes, and with sheer power of will overcoming, exposing himself deliberately to influences which would provoke lust or anger, and then resisting the lust and anger. And it's not going to lead to purity. You cannot impose purity by strong will and exposing yourself to contrary influence. The true purity comes from a change from within, with the emergence of something which is already fundamentally different. As it fills your emotions, suddenly lust is so crude, anger is so coarse, thoughts which are petty and selfish are so pointless and silly and superficial, they just fall away. And that's the only way one can get true purity of one's being. You cannot do it by external exercise. In many of the practices, not spiritual again, but like pranic healing or Reiki, where the goal is to channel vital energy, pranic energy basically, they call it spiritual healing, but it's not spiritual, it's vital. Where they involve channeling energy of some kind, there's a great importance given to purity, because energies can be of all kinds and sometimes very crude and coarse. So the purification is an important part of their practice. But what is missed in that whole process which is taught, you have to keep purifying yourself and keep purifying. Because you're living in the domain of the vital, open to the universal cosmic vital energy that you're drawing in for the purpose of healing, And the moment you're open, well, it's all going to come. Everything that's out there is going to come in. How do you ever purify yourself? You keep purifying and it clouds you, and again purify. It's never going to end. You can go on. It's very similar to what certain traditions of extreme Buddhism, radical Buddhism do, spending all their life in burning up their karma. The more you do this japa or this exercise or that activity or charity, you're burning up karma somehow until at some point you'll exhaust it and get free. Because it's a whole mathematical machinery. But in the very act of doing, you're creating more karma. In the very act of interacting with people, you're engaging yourself with more karma. So you become more and more isolated until it leads to nothing. The whole point is all of these methods fail in their very approach because they don't recognize the deeper truth. The influence of the deeper spiritual presence filling you not only transcends karmic knots, but can dissolve knots easily. You do not need to reduce karma to mathematics. But unfortunately, in the Buddhist teaching, the soul and God having been removed, the whole world is like one big giant machine of energy. And so it becomes mathematical. And the same in Jainism. It becomes almost mathematical. The moment you bring back the soul, the self, they are not karmically bound. They are free always, and their action on the karma can freely dissolve a karma or turn a negative karma into a positive karma and make a good use out of it. Here's an energy waiting to be released, currently stuck in a negative form. Well, you turn it to give a positive form. An energy which was destructive can be turned into an energy which is protective. And it can be done by the action of the self or the soul. And the purification similarly cannot be done as long as you live in a consciousness which is part of the universal ocean of mixture. It's only when the inner spiritual consciousness fills and purifies from within that the things which are contrary to it have no hook, they cannot stay, and they simply pass. Even if they pass through you, they don't touch you. And that's the symbol given in the Bhagavad Gita of the lotus leaf. It can be in the water, surrounded by water. You can pour all the water you want on it, dip it in water, but the moment it comes up, it's dry because the water never touched it. So all the world's passions which belong in the universal vital consciousness could pass right through you, and nothing in you is touched, nothing in your response. That's the nature of true purity. Not creating walls around you and pushing out and fighting the invasion of what is infinite against what is finite. You will never win. So I'm pointing to each of these things to show you the error of that understanding, and especially when one takes to the ethical and moral purification, there's only so much you can do on the strength of your personal will. So, regulation of conduct according to a religious or ethical formula. Sorry, I've skipped one point. Not an ethical turn. Spirituality is not an ethical turn of mind or moral purity and austerity. Now you can do all the austerity you want. Stand on one leg, not eat so many things, not do this, and deny yourself, suffer as a consequence. And people say, oh, what a great spiritual man, he has been denying himself so much and suffering so much. And mothers comment on this, very blunt. She says, the only benefit of such austerity is to aggrandize your ego, nothing else. Certainly not a shred of spirituality. Why though that kind of austerity crept in? Some of it came from these mixed understandings, but some of it, the justification was, in the very effort of denial of yourself, you are building a strong willpower. So in many traditions, to build a strong will, they would take up a vow. I will not do, as a result of this initiation, hereafter I will not do this. And one of the ways they would do it is give up something which you particularly like to eat or do. So that self-denial somehow was a way of strengthening the willpower. But if you lost the sense of purpose of this and you thought it had a spiritual or moral value, well, It serves nothing except aggrandizing the ego. Then next, not religiosity. Spirituality is not religiosity or an ardent and exalted emotional fervor. They've given enough examples of that. Go to most Indian temples, you'll find people clapping, jumping, singing. In the United States of America, there's a similar thing called Negro spiritual singing. And you will find them singing, dancing, the whole group swinging their hips and jumping around. Some of them actually literally start jumping in excitement. And all of this is considered religious fervor, and they will say, now the power of God is on you and the miracles will happen. And sometimes miracles do happen. But why? Not from a spiritual power, from the vital excitement that is generated. Either the power of the vital excitement is then channeled for a particular outcome, for someone to get well or whatever, or more often than not, that is used as a feeding ground for vital beings who come there to feed. And in return, they give you something of their magical result as an intervention, so that they continue to build a following and build a movement. So there are many such emotional fervors, religiosities, and in the ashram, Mother explicitly forbade this kind of thing. Yes, there is singing. There is even beautiful singing of devotional kind. But she said none of the swaying of vital excitement or swaying of the body and these things which cover the psychic touch. She was very particular not to allow this mixture. In even forms of Indian dance, a large part of it is vital, really. Even when the vital turns to in consecration to God, the whole energy of that play and force is of a vital character. Otherwise, it's not entertaining as a dance form. So there is a spiritual aspiration expressed through a vital form. And surely it is helpful for purifying the vital, for training the vital to serve the divine and so on. Extremely useful for that purpose. But in itself, it covers the deeper psychic touch and the psychic influence. So you could go through an excellent training of that and your vital would be a great instrument, but in the very process of the training, you would have covered up or lost contact with the deeper sensitivity of the psychic. And one has to choose. Can you build that first and then perhaps work on the vital? Maybe that could be possible. So Mother's effort here was always to bring that deeper contact first, because that's the easiest, simplest way to get to the foundation of the spirituality, the purity with it, and the guidance of the divine presence within, which can then avoid all these mixtures and take you through. The soul, the true soul, the psychic being, is often described in the yoga tradition as the swan. And the swan, it is said, if you give to it milk mixed with water, the swan can drink the milk and leave behind the water. Now, physical swans cannot do that, obviously. But the symbol of the soul does that in any mixture. And we have to assume everything is mixed, because that's where we are in our evolution. But the soul's influence, wherever it is, to whatever extent it is there within you, will instantly distinguish, this is mixed. It will recognize that which is pure. And its influence filling you will nurture the purity, nurture the direct spiritual base, foundation, give even in your mind and in your heart the ethical, moral, and the aesthetic turn, awaken in the emotions, the higher aspiration, and so on, but always from a source which will be recognized in its purity, now filling these instruments and working to purify and develop them Godward. So finally, Sri Aurobindo, this is not even a compound of all these excellent things. They are excellent in themselves, but we must know they are not spiritual. And finally, a mental belief, creed or faith in the mind. An emotional aspiration, a regulation of conduct according to a religious or ethical formula are not spiritual achievement and experience. And two things here, achievement and experience, because we tend to think they are an achievement. So and so person, all his life, he's never eaten meat, he's never touched alcohol, never smoked. Every day he has walked so many steps barefoot, done so many rounds, repeated these prayers so many times, read such and such a book so many times. It's not a spiritual achievement. Achievement of willpower, maybe a moral achievement, perhaps. Achievement of discipline of the body, of following a mechanical routine and being stuck in it. But spiritually, it's not an achievement. This is very important to recognize because we value people by those things. And this is a problem which I face very often when I go to places where these kinds of things are celebrated as spirituality or the epitome of the religious practice or teaching. And I've been to places, monasteries of different traditions, lines of monks, priests, trainees sitting, body shaking as they move, because after a while when you breathe in rhythm with the words, your body starts moving and then it gets amplified and then they all are moving in synchronization, an entire line of people going. You look at them, look at the consciousness, their mind is wandering elsewhere while they are repeating mechanically. There's nothing of the feeling felt, just a mechanical routine. In certain countries like in Thailand, Cambodia, they put children in monasteries because free education, free food, because of extreme poverty. All the children go through that education. It's extremely good for a moral turn of the nature. It teaches them to become non-violent, to become caring for others and so on. It has enormously impacted the value of that culture. It is such a beautiful culture. But in itself, it has not opened to the spirituality. If such a person with a moral base, with an ethical clarity, with a high intellectual training and development, with a certain emotional self-giving and dedication, where to turn to spirituality and enter a spiritual practice or experience, perhaps you would have a vessel which would be very effective in whatever it seeks, depending on the kind of training. Sometimes the training itself binds you so deeply into the form of the training that you're unable to enter the spiritual. The person who has gone into that mechanical thing for a few years, if you tell him now, let go of all this, simply immerse yourself in the spiritual presence. And he says, but I feel empty, I feel pointless, I have to do something. And the form so binds that they are unable to get to something deeper, or whatever deeper experience comes, they have to fit it into the form. But if it has not been done in such a narrow and rigid way, and a basic culturing has been done, which should be part of our educational system, giving a spiritual orientation to the thought and the emotions and even the body, then such a person entering the spiritual life and a spiritual pursuit would have an enormous ease and rapidity of awakening. So this is how the mother defined the object of the school in the ashram. She said, the children should be helped to grow into straightforward, frank, upright, honorable human beings, ready to develop into divine nature. The last part is interesting. Ready to develop, not necessarily that they have done anything of the spiritual. Straightforward, frank, upright, honorable. If you think about all these four words, what it represents is a transparency, where you are not deceiving yourself. And unfortunately, when you teach methods, systems, following the groove, wake up at this time, do these practices, unfortunately, the side effect is a kind of a self-deception. I have done so much, and so I must be more great. I must be more developed. And so Mother actually went so far as to say, I have not put any regulations, any rules, any routines that they have to follow, not even waking up at a fixed time or going to the samadhi and so on, not even repeating any words, not even sitting for meditation, not even saying good morning, not even being polite. Because she said, the moment you teach something, people will do it, and the very act of pretense will create a first layer of self-deception. I would rather, she said, that they are completely honest with themselves. If they are crude, they behave crude, but with no self-deception or covering of pretense of sophistication, hiding the crudeness behind. So if they are transparent, honest, straightforward for what they are, and from there they turn to something higher as an ideal, or even to her, because they were meeting her every day at that point, she could work upon them, take that as raw material and shape it and lift it. And to the extent they came like this, she was able to do it successfully. So she preferred, she said, that you come not as this little angelic being, deceptive, hiding, putting the best part of yourself in front, but you come as you are, bared, with all your good and bad parts equally exposed and open to her, and she could fill you with her light and purify and clear everything. I'm dwelling on this in the context of this discussion because you can see how much more valuable such an approach could be if that was your goal. That we stand before the divine in whatever form, manner that we relate to the divine, in whatever space that we feel the connection most directly. Bare ourselves entirely, as thoroughly as you can, without judgment of what is good and bad or ugly within you. This is how it is. And open yourself and invoke her presence, her light, her force to work in you to change it. First illumine with her light, work with her force to change and to liberate from the limitations, and fill you with her love. And what you will receive will be so much more valuable, and in a single contact of emergence in the divine, so much more will be done spiritually in terms of growth of consciousness. So there is still the rest of the paragraph, which we will take up next time. We have finished our time because we started late. But I'll just read it so that it completes the thought. These things are of considerable value to mind and life. They are of value to the spiritual evolution itself as preparatory movements, disciplining, purifying, or giving a suitable form to the nature. But they still belong to the mental evolution. The beginning of a spiritual realization, experience, change is not there, is not yet there. So, your mental training is perhaps more complete with this, but even the beginning of spiritual realization, experience, or change is not yet. What is then spirituality? And now he describes this. We will study this in great detail, but now you will see it in the context of what we just discussed of bearing ourselves before the divine presence. Spirituality is in its essence an awakening to the inner reality of our being, to a spirit, self, soul, which is other than our mind, life and body. An inner aspiration to know, to feel, to be that, to enter into contact with the greater reality beyond and pervading the universe, which inhabits also our own being, to be in communion with it and union with it. So communion leading to union. And a turning, a conversion, a transformation of our whole being as a result of the aspiration, the contact, the union. So the moment you have this contact, to whatever extent it takes you, there's the change which takes place. And finally, a growth or waking into a new becoming or new being, a new self, a new nature. Now, all of this describes series of not only stages, steps, but also facets of the experience of true spirituality, and all at an essential level. So we will dwell upon each of these. Next time we will look at how these things can be nurtured and cultivated in our daily life and routine as steps. And even what is described in the subsequent steps, at least a movement towards it can be begun wherever we are, as we are, with whatever limitations and mixtures and ignorance we are in now. It doesn't matter. The process can begin. And as it begins itself, it leads to a greater clarity, purity, and awakening of experience, and it completes us. So we'll pause here and dwell on this, meditate on this for a while. And again, I remind that the picture that we get when we look at things in this way is there is very little, a very small part of humanity that's truly seeking a spiritual life. A lot of that which is seeking the religious life is not seeking the spiritual, but the touch of the spiritual in their religiosity or in their intellectual aspiration or curiosity. A need for just a little bit. And Sri Aurobindo uses the word a modicum, a tiny amount. You get that, you feel good, and you're satisfied with it. And it's fine for those who are satisfied with it. But when the time comes, when you're not satisfied with the modicum and you wish to go deeper, then you have to recognize what is not enough and what it is that is the true spirituality, and then begin that process. And that's why this text is so important for us to recognize. We have to consciously recognize the distinction and enter fully with a total dedication in the spiritual awakening, if so we feel ourselves called to do. When people came to the ashram telling the mother, now I have retired from life and I want to join the ashram, or somebody comes and says, I'm fed up with my life, I'm disgusted with the world, I want to join the ashram. Mother said, sorry, this is not the place for you. You're seeking for peace, you go somewhere else where peace is the goal. Here she would say the goal is work. If you're willing to work hard, then you come here. Of course, many people were not happy. But the work here is not merely physical work. That too can be made a part of the consecrated part of the sadhana, but it is the inner work of becoming conscious, of working on oneself to develop and open all of our whole being, all of our nature to the divine Shakti. And it is work which is demanding, most intensely demanding, because it requires complete honesty with yourself, no self-deception, and utter sincerity. And just that is not at all comfortable. When you look into yourself and you see all this confusion, which is normal human nature, it can be easily discouraging. But if you recognize that it is not your effort which will liberate you from it, but the divine Shakti working in you, and you give yourself as a child to her, then what seemed to be such a difficult effort becomes now something so simple, so direct, and so joyously effortless. Yes, you do make an effort, but the joy of it filling the effort makes it feel as if it is effortless. And so this is the way that we will consciously orient ourselves to. We can meditate on this for a few minutes.